All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Supreme Beef and Iowa's CAFO problem, Sacrificing Iowa's Waters for Big Ag. This webinar is co-hosted by the Iowa Environmental Council and the Sierra Club Iowa chapter. And we are recording the webinar and it will be posted later on YouTube. So you'll be able to watch it or rewatch it if you miss anything or need to log off at any point. So we'll go ahead and get started here. And just to give you a little bit of a roadmap for what we're going to be discussing this evening, we'll do some quick introductions. And then we're going to do a little bit of background on the Supreme Beef facility and why this particular example is important to discuss. Then we'll move into the panel discussion and the Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions as you think of them, go ahead and put those in the Q&A box, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen. And we'll get to all of those at the very end. And we prefer you put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat because they can get lost in the chat box. So we're going to start off with introductions for our presenters. We'll introduce the panelists later when we move into the panel session. So for now, my name is Alicia Vasto. I'm the Water Program Associate Director at the Iowa Environmental Council. Mike Schmidt, our staff attorney, is joining me from IEC. And for those of you who aren't familiar with IEC, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization focused on environmental law and policy here in the state of Iowa, mainly clean energy and clean water issues. And I will pass it to Jess to introduce herself and the Sierra Club.
Thank you, Alicia. My name is Jess Mazur, and I'm the Conservation Program Coordinator with the Sierra Club Iowa chapter. And the Sierra Club Iowa chapter is an environmental nonprofit here in Iowa. We've been around since 1972. We have over 6,000 members across the state that are volunteering their time and taking action to protect natural areas and the environment in Iowa. And we're also joined here with Wally. If you want to wave, Wally, he's our legal chair of the Sierra Club Iowa chapter. And then two other important people on our team that have been working hard on the Supreme Beef situation is Larry Stone, who's a water quality advocate and Clayton County resident. So he's been doing a lot of the work locally. And then Larry, you want to wave? And then we have Steve Facil, who has been doing a lot of the digging into the application and correcting DNR on some of their NATs and finding out where those errors are. He's a water quality advocate and retired ISC permit. So Steve, if you'd like to give a wave quick. All right, and with that, I think we're gonna spend the next about 10 minutes or so just bringing people up to speed on Supreme Beef. So I'm going to hand it over to Larry Stone, and he is going to give us a little bit of background information. And Larry, you're on mute.
Okay. The whole project started more than 4 years ago, spring of 2017, or even earlier, late 2016. First proposed as Walls Energy, with supposedly with manure from at least 10,000 head of cattle that would supplemented by other organic waste, perhaps from convenience stores, to be put into an anaerobic digester to produce methane biogas, which would then be scrubbed and injected into a natural gas pipeline. One of the developers, John Hammond, claimed that they were really a renewable energy company, just happened to need 10,000 head of cattle to make it work. We were going to have them on the site by the end of 2017. The partners were Hammond and Heath Kellogg of the Feeder Creek Group, along with Jared, Dean, and Mike Walls. There was a controversy during the construction, which was continuing early in the spring and into the summer of 2017 within the DNR. They couldn't decide if this was a livestock operation or an industrial operation, what permits might be needed, what public hearings might be needed. Meanwhile, construction continued without permits. There were some notices of violation of what runoff from the construction site sent from the DNR to Walls Energy. Eventually, the DNR said they needed a national pollution discharge elimination permit. They scheduled a hearing after several of us requested that. The hearing was canceled, rescheduled. September 2017, they decided the DNR issued a permit for a 39 million gallon wastewater lagoon, not a livestock manure lagoon, and apparently no permit was needed for that. There continued to be questions about the permits needed, the violations of what permits construction might be happening. Finally, November of 2017, there was a public hearing with tremendous amount of opposition from the public because of the karst terrain, the sinkholes, the Bloody Run Creek. Then the permit, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination Permit, was issued in January of 2018. Problems continued. In June of 2018, the DNR staff said, we've had too many problems with this project. They asked the Environmental Protection Commission to refer the Wells Energy to the Attorney General. That did not happen. The Environmental Protection Commission declined to act. The work continued sporadically, despite mechanics liens against Wells Energy, lawsuits between Wells and the Feeder Creek Group, foreclosure action by the Prairie du Chien Bank that claimed the Wells owed them $13 million. The goal still was cattle by the end of the year. Fast forward to 2020, the application was resubmitted, this time by Supreme Beef, without the methane digester, but for 11,600 cattle. The manure was going to be spread on more than 40 fields in Clayton County and a couple in Alameda County. The DNR at first was going to reject that. They finally agreed to approve a facility with only 2,700 cattle. Fast forward again to February 2021, Supreme Beef resubmitted an application for the 11,600 cattle. We believe that that application was full of errors and inconsistencies. The DNR approved it anyway. We appealed to the Environmental Protection Commission. The lawyers rejected that. We asked the DNR director to use department discretion to reject it. The lawyers said that was not possible. And so this is the state we are at right now. And with that, Mike Schmidt, can you follow up with some more of the legal issues?
Yes, thanks, Larry. So the first thing that we worked on was part of the public notice period. Public notice is required for nutrient management plans, and it was published in a local newspaper. Larry saw the notice and requested a hearing, which is the only way to get a hearing for a nutrient management plan, and others did as well. The DNR scheduled the public hearing and accepted comments until after the hearing took place. It was an online virtual hearing, and DNR ended up receiving more than 100 comments opposing the project, including comments from IEC, Sierra Club, Larry, and Steve Vasey, who will talk more about that in just a minute. Some of the comments raised technical issues with the NMP, some were legal, some just opposed the project generally or highlighted the sensitivity of the terrain because this is on a karst landscape where groundwater and surface water interact a lot. But despite all of those comments, DNR approved the NMP over those objections, making minimal changes to the NMP, only rejecting a couple of fields after the internal DNR review. After the NMP was approved, we jointly petitioned the Environmental Protection Commission in May to reverse the DNR decision. Our petition was based on the deficiencies we identified in our original comments, but the AG's office, which represents the EPC, responded that the EPC did not have the authority to reverse the approval granted by the DNR. So instead, we went back to the DNR itself, which Wally can talk more about.
Thank you. As Mike said, we were rebuffed by the EPC, so we used a DNR rule that's been on the books for several years, although never been used. But the rule says the DNR can evaluate a proposed CAFO with respect to its potential impact on the environment, irrespective of any other rules or regulations there might be based on the specific factors involved in the particular situation. Some of these factors that the DNR can look at under this rule are the project's proximity to sensitive areas, including trout streams and karst terrain. Well, we have both here. We have the Bloody Run Creek, which is an outstanding Iowa water, so designated because of its ability to support the brown trout reproducing naturally. And this is a karst terrain all through the area. Other factors are the topography, slope, the means or routes of a conveyance of manure, whether spilled or land applied. The application fields where this manure is going to be spread on the crop fields is all highly erodible land right above Bloody Run Creek and other outstanding Iowa waters in the area. So all of those factors were present. And so we sent a request to the DNR, to the director herself, Kayla Lyon, asking the agency to use their authority under this particular rule. And we were able to get 47 organizations, state legislators, and other individuals to sign this request. But we were told that they would not, the department would not do this because they said they didn't have the authority, even though it's there in the rule. So we asked for further clarification and asked why they didn't have the authority. The DNR's attorney wrote back and said, we're not answering any more questions. So that's where it stands right now. All of the comments and concerns that we presented will be discussed now by Steve Vesey, who really dug into all of this. Steve?
Right. So there's 3 points I want to cover. I'm going to cover points 2 and 3 and then come back to point 1. So inadequate manure storage. There have been issues with lagoon design and approval since day one, and Wally was a point person on this. An unformed lagoon should simply not have been allowed in this area of karst. The final design incorporates one polyethylene liner, but we know that consulting engineers recommended a second liner, which was never included. We believe Supreme Beef plans to use a flush and recycle system to move the manure out of the 100-yard-long barns, but several consultants have told us they don't believe it will work with cattle manure. If they flush, that could significantly increase the storage volume needed, requiring the lagoon to be emptied more frequently. The section of the NMP where manure storage and handling should have been described in detail was simply left blank. Critically, we know that lagoons sited in areas of karst can collapse, opening new sinkholes, direct conduits for manure to enter the Bloody Run aquifer. This is not speculation. It happened to the town of Garnavillo wastewater facility in 1980. The next point about sensitive karst landscape and OIW watersheds. Karst refers to a geological formation. In the Midwest, it occurs in the driftless region, including Northeast Iowa, which escaped the leveling and silt deposition caused by the last ice age. Karst is characterized by shallow soils sitting on porous limestone and dolomite that are fractured and riddled with caves and sinkholes, leading to shallow aquifers that express as cool spring-fed creeks. Those aquifers are extremely vulnerable to contamination from the surface, including manure, nutrients, and disturbed soil. This is described in detail in the 2005 Iowa Geological Survey Guidebook, Living in Karst, that was used to persuade legislators to theoretically limit lagoons in these areas. In that same time frame, some of us were suing EPA for approving Iowa water quality standards that did not implement anti-degradation requirements of the Federal Clean Water Act. And long story short, this resulted in, among other things, establishing the category known as Outstanding Iowa Waters, deserving of special protection. And you guessed it, Bloody Run Creek is one of those waters. So now on to estimates, nitrogen and phosphorus production, which you'll see on the next slide. Thank you. Initially, DNR staff were receptive to technical issues I raised, but on October 2nd, 2020, the political hammer dropped. they were required to approve an interim NMP for 2,700 cattle and stand by to approve a final NMP for 11,600, regardless of NMP omissions or flaws. And there were many: incorrect Russell II soil loss and PNX calculations, expiring manure easement agreements, application fields way beyond the normal distance considered viable, no expressed conservation measures to protect highly erodible land, and the list goes on. But by far the biggest elephant in the room was the miscalculation of NNP nutrient content that by Iowa code determines the number of crop acres needed for spreading. Supreme Beef took nutrient concentration values and manure volume values from two different sources in order to estimate nutrient content. Concentration multiplied by volume does give content, but only if both measurements pertain to the same storage and handling situation. They chose a third-party concentration value where the manure appears to have been diluted and then multiplied by an undiluted volume value taken from DNR tables, then claimed that the product would correctly predict their manure NNP content. And that's just not scientifically or mathematically valid. They've underestimated the manure nutrient content by a factor of ×4 for nitrogen and by a factor of ×6 for phosphorus. I've pointed this out repeatedly to DNR staff, but they won't listen. They can't listen because this is the fatal flaw with the NMP. And politics, having previously dictated that a lagoon must be allowed, now dictates that the NMP must be approved regardless. Back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Steve. So I want to talk about, so why is this important? So right now we have boiled this down to three things. There's a lot of reasons it's important that have been listed above by our other speakers, but number one, through limited regulation and lack of enforcement, Iowa has created a safe haven for industrial agriculture operations. Our laws are not doing their job to protect our water, and our agencies are not doing their job to enforce the laws and the regulations that are on the books. Number two, DNR does not demonstrate discretion that is protective of Iowa's waters. So there are a number of examples of this in the Supreme Beef situation. When they had the opportunity under the director discretion rule to deny this because it's in a very fragile place and because it's just a really badly designed site, they didn't use their discretion. So they're not willing to use discretion that they do have to uphold their mission statement of protecting Iowa's natural resources. And third, state leadership is failing to protect Iowa's natural resources and public interest. So whether it's DNR Director Kayla Lyon, who refused to use her authority to deny the site, or we had State Senator Dan Zumba weighing in to pressure the DNR to approve this site, or any other agency head or legislator or governor who's not doing all that they can to stand up and protect our water. If they were, we would not be in the situation that we are. So this is why this is important. And I think it's time that we should go on to the panel, because that's why everyone who's joined us tonight is to hear from our experts talk about this in the bigger picture. Supreme Beef is an excellent example of what's wrong with Iowa's CAFO issue, but this is happening statewide. So let's talk a little bit more about Supreme Beef and then also draw some conclusions for statewide issues as well. So I want to thank our panelists for joining us today. We have four incredible panelists who are experts across the state on these issues. Dr. Chris Jones is a research engineer with IIHR Hydroscience and Engineering at University of Iowa. Gene Tinker is a former animal feeding operations coordinator for the Iowa DNR. Dr. Silvia Secchi is an associate professor, Department of Geographical and Sustainable Sciences at the University of Iowa. And Tom Murray is the founding member and president of Iowa's Coldwater Conservancy. So thank you very much for joining us. And let's get to our first question and this is for all of you to answer. So we'll just kind of go down the list. We'll start with Chris in the order that I read them off. Is what does the Supreme Beef case tell you about agriculture and the environment here in Iowa? What are your main takeaways from this case?
Sorry, I was muted there. My main takeaway from this is that, agriculture sees nothing in Iowa as sacred. And so they will take whatever they want to take. And so I think, it's pretty apparent that this area, Northeast Iowa and the Bloody Run Creek watershed is really vulnerable. to this sort of thing. And I mean, any rational person can see that. And so why go there? And clearly, the way we value these natural resources is not any sort of obstacle for people in agriculture. You know, when they set their eyes on it, they're not going to consider how the public values that piece of ground or that natural resource. And so, you know, we have these 35 outstanding waters, and I mean, they'll take them all if they can. So I think that's the message to take from this.
Thank you very much. Jean? Open, Jean, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you can hear you now.
Well, I think it comes right back to what Dr. Jones said in that we mistakenly think we have to accept every proposal put forward by ag to support the economy in our state. I am not opposed to an operation of this size, but I certainly feel the location is misplaced. We've got lots of good places in this state to grow the livestock industry, but people seem to think any place there's an open spot is a good place for a barn. I totally disagree with that. Director Jeff Bonk is one who advocated for the director's discretion rule. He's the one that got it drafted. He's the one that got it adopted. And his theory was quality natural resources will attract quality people. And there was recently an article in one of the papers, either the Cedar Rapids Gazette, Des Moines Register, I'm not sure which, on how much further people would travel to get to quality water sources, clean lakes and such. And so I think Director Vonk was correct because he knew the laws did not allow the discretion that was needed for places that were not good places for barns. It also shows the vast hole we've got in our regulations where when they came together with 519 on basic requirements for confinements, they didn't do anything for open feedlots because at the time they felt open feedlots were the real open feedlot, an unroofed area where livestock concentration was not as great. But based upon the wording in the code, an open feedlot is basically anything that's not totally roofed. And so that's why we've got what we have now, these barns that were legally built with no discretion because there was no construction permit required in order to build the barns because they're open feedlots. They're not confinements by law, even though they operate as confinements. And so now we're in a really bad spot because those barns have been built. The Walls family has spent the money to build those facilities. And since our law is backwards where it's build it and you will later be approved, they have to fight to get this nutrient management plan approved so they can build the barns or so they can utilize the barns that have already been built. Tremendous gap in our state's laws that needs to be fixed. And our legislative people have absolutely no interest in fixing those gaps.
Thank you, Jean. That is frustrating when you're kind of putting the cart before the horse. But all right, Dr. Secchi, do you want to add something in there?
Yeah, I want to say that we need to look at this in using the historical perspective. And essentially what Iowa decided to do after the farm crisis of the 1980s was to say, we are open for business and you can kill our people with pollution. We will do nothing about it. If you look at the way everybody in the state, starting with my alma mater, Iowa State, where there are faculty people saying that we can take twice as many pigs as we have now, while the maps clearly show that there are parts of the state where there isn't enough land to properly apply the manure. We're having problems watering those pigs, okay? The industry has essentially wants to make tabula rasa of people in Iowa. What we're gonna grow here is not children, is hogs. And we're gonna do it all over the state, okay? And so the lack of, it's not a coincidence that we are the biggest producer of pigs and the biggest producer of eggs in the country. It's because every other state where this has happened has put in place at least a modicum of regulation, and that has not happened here. So what we need to do is, I mean, this case is particularly egregious because one, it's in a fragile landscape. Two, it's in a still relatively pristine landscape. Three, the political involvement, whether it was completely on the up and up or not, you know, the appearance of corruption, you know, I'm Italian, right? Caesar's wife and all our politicians should be above the appearance of interference with the regulatory process. And then, of course, the regulatory process, as it has been described, is non-existence, because that's the way the industry likes it. And our legislature works for the industry. By the way, this is bipartisan, and it's at the state level and at the federal level. They don't work for us, they work for Big Ag. And this is pretty obvious from the landscape, where this manure management plants, the master matrix process, it's all a sham. And there is, there is effects of this in terms of our quality of life and whether people want to live here or move away from here.
Thank you very much. Tom, you want to close us out on that question? What does this mean with regards to agriculture?
Well, you know, I'm up here in Decorah, and I drive by there occasionally and have fished Bloody Run and streams around there. And I have to tell you that, you know, the level of disappointment among anglers and outdoors people, folks who enjoy recreation, they just can't believe this is happening, that it's been allowed to happen. It's just the wrong place for such an enterprise, and even with the best management practices possible. And what struck me was that those of us who live in farm country, we see the big equipment, the manure spreaders, the tractors that pull them. We see the, you know, all the different pieces of equipment that require human activity to make them work. But we also, you know, read constantly about manure spills throughout the state due to human error or equipment failure. And, you know, we haven't even talked about the repercussions from an enterprise this large when we consider the warming climate and the major flooding that occurred from major storms in 2008, 2016, 2018, the list just goes on and on. It's not going to get better. That's something that we are going to have a very difficult, challenging time to deal with. The other issues that you've all been talking about are things that we can deal with. And I'm hoping through our discussion this evening, we can come up with some solutions, or at least movements in the right direction. It's very frustrating.
Great, thank you all for your comments. I think pulling on that thread about the water quality issues is something that we should discuss a little more. So I guess this question is for Dr. Jones, but anybody else can hop in as well. So Dr. Jones, I was wondering if you could speak to the analysis that you've done about CAFOs popping up all over our state and really being concentrated in certain watersheds. Can you talk a little bit more about what you're finding with that research and reporting that you're doing? Oh, you're muted there.
So what we know with almost a certainty is that nutrient pollution in these livestock dense watersheds is higher than it is in other places. And so, that includes places like Northwest Iowa with the Floyd River and the Rock River, and then North Central Iowa with the South Fork of the Iowa River, and then in Southeast Iowa and Washington County, where we have a lot of problems too. And so in all those places, we have high densities of livestock. And the reason, livestock manure is a good fertilizer. I mean, we know that it brings some benefits that commercial fertilizer doesn't, organic nitrogen for the soil and some other things, excuse me. But we have some real weaknesses in our laws, and so the master matrix scheme for livestock siting and manure application endorses the over application of manure nutrients. And so for nitrogen, we allow farmers to go by the old yield goal strategy, which takes the expected corn yield in bushels per acre, and you multiply that by 1.2, and that's your acceptable nitrogen application rate. And that thing was discredited, 30 years ago almost, but that's what our regulation is based on. And then the guidelines or regulations, if you will, for phosphorus, our focus on the P index and slopes and so forth allow a real large over application of phosphorus to cropped fields, and that was the case in Bloody Run too. And so it's not like these farmers are doing anything illegal. They're just adhering. If they just adhere to the existing regulations, they're over applicating nutrients, over applying nutrients, and polluting the water. And so we really need to revisit our laws on this. I mean, it's really crazy the way we have things. And so we see, in Bloody Run, we have a watershed that's about the size of the city of Des Moines, and we're putting 12,000 animals in there. A cow producing the waste of about 14 people. How this is going to work is just, beyond comprehension. And, we really need some changes in how we do things with this siting of facilities, and then, how we dictate how farmers manage the waste.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Did anyone want to jump in on that, or ready to go on to the next question?
Well, I just wanted to add that one of the things that the master matrix does not do, and one of the things that people are really unwilling to discuss, is that we need to look at this at the landscape level, right? And so when we look at these regulations, they tell you, you have to be at least this far from this or this far from that, but it doesn't tell you, in this county, we can't take more than X animal units because we can't take more than X than Y manure. And so, the other thing is these manure management plans are not digitized. And so a farmer, and Farmer Bob and Farmer Jane can both claim the same field for the manure, right? So I think that there are very not hard things that can be done. For example, digitizing this manure management plans that can show us, even in principle, because then there's the monitoring issue. I'm assuming all farmers are following their manure management plans and applying the manure where it's supposed to be applied, but nobody's checking them, right? And so we have a failure of governance that goes from the planning of how these things are cited to the monitoring of these things, and the fact that that nobody is willing to speak in proper English at the land grant university about the disaster that this is a slow disaster in the making for 40 years now. The water's getting worse. The other thing to keep in mind is there's like very, very few farmers that are raising animals in this fashion. So we are essentially sacrificing the public good for a very, very small percentage of people in Iowa. And, you know, all of the way to the supply chain, because we all know what's been happening in the meatpacking plants, upstream, you know, downstream in the supply chain. So I think we have a lot of systemic issues that we have to address in animal agriculture that have been compounded because we have not done so for a long time.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. Thank you for the answer. I actually did a case study on 5 counties with manure management plans in 2015. And we found that double dumping you're talking about, multiple fields in one plan, and DNR didn't do anything about it. Which kind of leads us to the next question that I want to ask Jean is, so are they taking that into consideration, what Dr. Jones and Dr. Secchi were saying? And if not, if they're not taking into consideration how much manure is already being applied in the county, or, you know, or anything in manure management plans, what are they taking into consideration? Oh no, did we just lose Jean? He may have just lost some internet. So let's go on to, does anyone want to answer that question, or we should go on to the next one and save that for when Jean hops back on? Okay, let's go up to Tom. We're going to switch to Tom here. Let's see. So how do operations like Supreme Beef threaten cold water trout streams in Northeast Iowa recreation? Oh, and Tom, you're muted.
It's fairly obvious when you see these major rain events, and even with operator error or equipment breakdowns, our hills are so steep up here that if anything happens in the tributaries or within the springs that feed Bloody Run, for example, it's going to really be demonstrated on the stream. And you know, these beautiful trout streams bring thousands and thousands of visitors every year to Northeast Iowa. It's absolutely huge for these communities from an economic development standpoint. But from a health standpoint, it's even more important because, you know, you've got a system here that I'd like to just read to you from an email I received recently from ICC board member Rick Zarwell in Lansing, not far away from Bloody Run, who grew up in New Albany. And it really is a comment to legislators and to all of us as citizens. The best water quality in Iowa originates from Coldwater springs and numerous feeder streams here in Northeast Iowa that provide drinking water to Iowans across the entire state to the south, southwest, and west via our karst geology, plus provide a home for trout, by the way. So, you know, really, we're really talking here about water quality for humans. The trout aspect of it is certainly of importance, but I think we have to look at what not only what we're doing within our own state, but what are we doing once it gets down to the Mississippi. And if you've been to Bloody Run, you know, it's only about a 1.5 mile shoot down to the Mississippi, and from there all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So I just feel like the situation is much, much more serious, and it is just a serious accident waiting to happen. And we're typically in such a reactive, you know, we're always reacting to a problem. And it seems to me that if we had the right rules, regulations, and enough people on board to do the monitoring of our water and of the CAFOs and other, you know, large animal productions, we'd be in a much better position to act proactively. Could you hear all that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are really great points. And I think it kind of leads into this discussion about economics and the other things that we value here in the state. So I'm going to pose this question to Dr. Secchi, but of course anyone can jump in. Dr. Secchi, I was wondering if you could speak to the other value that we should be considering when we think about industrial agriculture, when we think about the value of our landscape and our natural resources, with tourism and recreation, as well as some of those other intangible benefits. What value does the driftless region hold for Iowans and local communities that we're kind of disregarding in this?
Yeah, I have a couple of, so my first anecdote that I want to share with everybody is that the nutrient reduction strategy has a cost benefit analysis done for all the best management practices, or BMPs, that they include in their science-based approach. And they are the costs to the farmers and the benefits to the farmers. Let me tell you, I have a PhD in economics. That's not how you do cost benefit analysis. And so even though there was some really good work being done by my former boss, Kathy Kling, and which is now being continued at the Center for Ag and Rural Development at Iowa State, we are really not paying enough attention and not quantifying these benefits in terms of recreation. And as you know, Alicia, because we worked together on the report, there's issues related to drinking water. And I just want to point out that one thing that gets often ignored here is that there is a huge environmental justice component to this. Not just in terms of recreation, because, it would be really nice in Iowa City if the kids could go to the beach by the river, right? Instead of me being terrified every time I see somebody, getting a float out of the river, that they're going to get something, right? Some kind of, I hope that they don't have any scratches, and I hope they didn't drink the water. Okay. So I think it would disproportionately benefit those of us who have less resources to have clean water for recreate in the state. This is a river state, and people go to Minnesota to recreate. People go to the Ozarks to recreate. It's kind of appalling, actually. And I would say that that goes for drinking water too. That the people who live in rural areas, the smaller towns that have to upgrade their water treatment plants, the people who drink well water. So I think that this environmental justice aspect of our pollution is something that's being vastly understudied, and we need to think about more. And I would also say that when it comes to the driftless, I'll put this in the chat, but there is a really great book written by a geographer about the driftless, and he focuses on Wisconsin, but this applies to Iowa. These were some of the areas that were first settled and destroyed the first time by settlers before the 20th century because of soil erosion. They were inappropriately farmed. And we fixed that in the 1930s, right? With the New Deal and the Conservation Corps and the Soil Conservation Service. And so now we're gonna do this again, a second time. Within 200 years, we're going to ignore the landscape and what it tells us, ignore the geology and what it tells us, and repeat the mistakes of the past on a larger scale. And I think it is an indictment of what white people have done to Iowa and to Iowa's landscape if this thing cannot be addressed properly.
Thank you very much. So Gina, I'm going to bring this question back to you. So kind of like thinking about what Dr. Secchi was just saying and what Dr. Jones was saying, what everyone's saying about that we need to make sure that we're protecting our natural resources. We know that manure management plans aren't online, they're not really being double checked. So the question kind of goes, so if they're not taking into consideration recreation, drinking water, manure management plans, and any of the other things we've talked about, what is DNR considering when they're making their decisions? And Jean, you're on mute.
Their number one issue, since they're a state agency, is are they going to get paid? So manure management plans, you send in a fee. Nutrient management plans, you do not. If you don't send your manure management plan in, or you're late sending it in, you've got a $5,000 fine. It's a paperwork violation, but it's a $5,000 fine. If you over apply manure, or if you apply manure to a field that's not in your plan, and the DNR can document this, they say don't do it again. So when you have true environmental issues, they say don't do it again. When you have a paperwork issue, they say get your checkbook out. So a lot of it is based on how it's set up, with money being the primary driving factor. I always said that the animal feeding operations was the best designed program in the DNR because the users of the program paid for the program. But then that money disappears. The state auditor documented that the department is in violation of state law by how it utilizes the money that comes in from manure management plans. So we've got a program that's set up appropriately, but not implemented appropriately, because we want to use those dollars for other things than going out and checking what's actually going on in the field. The nutrient management plan is only voluntary for the livestock industry. We also have the municipalities that are part of that plan, and it is not voluntary for them. They are required to make improvements. The ag industry, producers, it's a voluntary program. There's a lot of things that are not being documented. Number one, we know every year how much commercial fertilizer is applied. As we get more livestock operations in the state, we should be utilizing less commercial fertilizer every year. But yet, surprisingly, the Department of Agriculture doesn't want to report those numbers. I've always been curious why that is. I have a good suspicion, because it's not showing us what we should see. Nutrient management plans, manure management plans, they write down where the manure goes. Unfortunately, we don't know if those are actually true or not. Most of these applicators are now GPS connected with auto steer. They have electronic records of where that manure gets applied, and they make certain the DNR never sees those electronic records. They make certain DNR only has access to handwritten records where you can document what needs to be documented, so it's all appropriate. This could all be corrected, but it's going to take legislative intent to do so.
Jean, for those insights. I guess I was kind of forming a question based on what you were just talking about the nutrient reduction strategy. And a lot has been said about the voluntary nature of the nutrient reduction strategy and how ineffective that is. I was wondering, Dr. Jones or anybody else, if you could talk a little bit about how, in particular, the livestock industry manure management has not been really accounted for in the nutrient reduction strategy, and what kind of policy changes we should have to address that issue.
So, yeah, we have two different issues here, one with the nutrient strategy and then one with the siting of this and other CAFOs. So the nutrient strategy, did not do a good job of, assessing the issues with manure. And we all know that, even, people close to the nutrient strategy will admit that we didn't really know that. And the reason it didn't is because there's all this uncertainty around manure. And so we have this rule, as Jean was talking about there, but, we really don't have really good record keeping or aggregation of data or enforcement or any of these things that it would allow us to make objective decisions about manure. And so as a result of a nutrient strategy, largely ignored it. And I mean, everybody knows that. Every scientist connected to the nutrient strategy knows that. So we have two different things here we're talking about with the nutrient strategy and then the siting of these CAFOs. You know, the issue with the CAFOs, and you know, Gene touched on this, is we need rule changes. And so the deck is stacked. I mean, let's just admit it here. I mean, everybody knows this, even the farmers know it. The deck is stacked in favor of the siting of these facilities and in the application of manure. There's very little enforcement. The rule allows over application. We know that farmers come back with commercial manure after applying the amounts that are outlined in the manure management plan. Sioux County in Iowa, you know, the highest density livestock in the county is like 11th in commercial fertilizer sales. You know, so how does that work here? If we're gonna, you know, get our arms around this, we have to be able to manage nutrients at the watershed scale. You know, I say that over and over again, and that, you know, there's just no way for us to do that right now. The rules we have are bad. And, you know, that's just the way it is. And so we know that the other thing I should point out here that's important for people to know, that, you know, if we made farmers comply with agronomic needs of the crops when it comes to manure, we would restrict the expansion of the livestock industry. And so, you know, right now farmers apply, you know, way more than what the Iowa State recommended rates are in terms of manure nutrients. Well, if we made them apply at the recommended rates, what we would do is we would expand the area needed to apply the manure. And because of the cost for hauling, you know, that would constrict the industry. And believe me, everyone in agriculture knows this. But that seems to be something that, you know, people in the legislature just don't understand. That if we required agronomic rate application of manure, we would constrict the livestock industry. Believe me, they know that. The farmers do anyway.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Dr. Secchi, this one is for you. So going off of the nutrient reduction strategy, not really incorporating livestock or manure, what is it, like something that we can all really relate to? What is the cost of that in our rural and urban communities when we aren't taking this seriously and aren't mandating changes?
Yeah, I think that one thing that I would like for everybody in the audience to remember is that agriculture is a heavily subsidized industry, okay? And we subsidize agriculture to pollute because we subsidize the production of corn and soybeans, which pollute our air and water, and then feed our animals, you know, some of them not necessarily happily, because, you know, cows are ruminants and in nature they don't eat corn. Surprise, surprise, right? And so what we're doing is we are paying farmers to pollute, and then with all these voluntary approaches, we're paying them to clean up the pollution that we have paid for. And so this is a highly dysfunctional and inefficient system. The goal of this system is not to clean up the air and the water. These are all hidden subsidies and income support for farmers. And agriculture has become so much more concentrated that the money is going to a smaller group of bigger farmers, okay? So this is a little game of cards that we've been playing by then repeating what my 15-year-old coined the term propaganda, repeating tropes like we're feeding the world when half of Iowa's corn goes to ethanol, and we are farmers are stewards of the land when if we don't pay them, and sometimes even if we do try to pay them, they don't want to clean up their act. So we have a real problem in that the approach that we're following is ineffective and is costing the taxpayers money, and it's still being peddled as the best we can do, an honest effort. Let us wait another 40 years to see if the water gets worse, or gets better. I mean, I've heard it all before. I've been living in Iowa for a long time, and so what I really think we need to do is think about the system. These CAFOs exist because we subsidize the production of commodity grains. These are highly fossil fuel intensive crops, and they pollute our air and water. We need to break this link, this functional link between animals not being on the landscape. And so we can raise 50 gazillion pigs in Iowa because, hey, they live in condos like they were in New York, and we need to stop this monocropping. We need to diversify our crop production. We need to subsidize that rather than, if we want to subsidize, rather than the production of corn and beans. And I think when we break this link between animals that are not on the landscape and just two crops, we are going to get some bang for our buck. Right now, we are certainly not.
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing to think about is what kind of system could we have here in the state if we weren't doing this monocropping, and really think about the diversity of our landscape and then the diverse uses that we could really have with all the other users that are important here in Iowa. We're getting a lot of really great questions from the audience. So one that came in that I'm going to pose to you, Tom, is basically, I think this person is asking, up in Northeast Iowa, in the local area, what are you hearing, or what kind of conversations are you having about the long-term impacts of the kind of livestock operations that are being built up there on the area, and other impacts on other businesses up in the area that could have? Oh, you're on mute there.
That's it really is an excellent question, and one that I've been thinking about myself for a number of years. It just seems to happen, when you least expect it. You get a big rainstorm, and the next thing you know, you've got a major issue in some community. We're all sited close to rivers and streams up here. And so, that's a real plus, and it can be a real minus. But I think that most people up here, they're just so conscious of their water. If you live in the country, you want to get that water checked at least once a year, maybe more. I remember going to that first public session that was down in Elkader and that Larry mentioned earlier, when they were first reviewing this whole plan from the Waltz family, and when they were still talking about the methane digester. And I remember there was an older gentleman sitting behind me, and a retired farmer living very humbly from his description of where he lived, on a small farm surrounded by much, much larger farms and very close to this operation. And he just said, I've already drilled 3 wells. Who's going to pay me to do the 4th when this one, when this plan fails? And I think that's the situation that most people don't realize, how many people up here really think about that. And if you live in a city, you turn on the tap, you don't really think about it too much. I grew up in Davenport. We seldom had major problems. And I think that's true in most major cities in Iowa, or larger cities in Iowa. But when you get out into rural Iowa, it's a whole different ballgame. And, people are really becoming much, much more aware of their water, where it's coming from. They're becoming much more thoughtful about where their food is coming from. So I guess I'm trying to give you my perspective from rural Northeast Iowa, right where this is located.
Thank you. And I think that's a really important perspective, because I think we're all struggling to think about how do we have conversations with people about this issue, especially because we all have someone in our family or our friends or someone we work with that is connected to agriculture in some way. And a lot of the time it's farmers that are trapped in the system, and not always that they're necessarily bad guys, but we have to get better at how we talk about this with people. So Dr. Secchi, can you provide some ideas for how do we talk about this issue, especially when a lot of people in the public still believe that this is producing a lot of jobs and revenue from the area, and that if we fight these, we're just anti-farm, anti-business. How can we talk about this and be more successful in moving people towards the vision that we have?
So to me, one thing that we don't talk enough about is the average age of Iowa farmers is almost 60 years old. And because at least some of the value of the subsidies gets capitalized into land values, what this is doing is making it very, very difficult for people who are not from a farming background, who don't have access to that land, who don't have the lawyers who have prepared succession planning to enter into farming. So we're making farming, we are making farming essentially harder to access for a whole variety of people because of the way we're essentially just subsidizing one kind of production. And so I think when people think about farming, they don't just think about growing corn and beans, or I hope they don't. And if they do, maybe they need to think again, right? Because I think we need to, after COVID especially, think about a more resilient system where we grow at least some of our food in Iowa. We don't just ship it all from California, where they're having all sorts of problems right now with climate change and droughts, right? So this diversifying agriculture in the state would have benefits for a lot of people, for the people who eat here and the people who farm here. And I think this is largely a Farm Bill federal problem, but there's things that the state could do. Vermont, for example, has a well-funded state initiative to produce food in the state. We don't do anything like that here in Iowa. So I think we may want to bring the conversation back to how rural areas and agriculture can provide value added for Iowans. And we're not just exporting corn and beans, and we're not just feeding pigs and sending them to China. But we have a rural economy that is better integrated with, a healthy ecosystem, healthy water, healthy air. We have more industry associated with agriculture beyond ethanol, which anyway is going to disappear because we're moving towards electric cars. And we have a more robust, resistant, resilient for climate change system. I think this is an agriculture that more Iowans would see themselves into. The agriculture we have is really what Iowa was in the 1950s. We're in the 21st century now. We should live in the 21st century, not keep looking back at things that are no longer relevant.
Does anyone want to add on to that?
Yeah, I do. And so I don't want to say I'm a native Iowan because I know Silvia hates that. So I'll just say I grew up here, and my folks were from small town Iowa, and I think anybody that's been here, I'm 60 years old, and so anybody that's seen Iowa for the length of time I have knows that rural Iowa has changed. And so we're seeing the demise of our small towns, and I see a lot of comments here about jobs, and don't these facilities produce jobs, and how do we respond to that? Well, the consolidation of the livestock industry has cost a lot of jobs. And so, we used to have 5,000 school districts in Iowa, and now we have 330. And so how do we say that this consolidation of the livestock industry has helped rural Iowa and has created jobs? I mean, sure, if you're a truck driver in Monona and you're hauling some cattle, yeah, I see where that's, your job. But, what's the 10,000 foot view here? It's not, we haven't created jobs. We've caused the demise of these towns with these systems that we have, and the permissibility that we have in terms of the environmental stuff has just facilitated that whole thing.
Yeah, I was wondering, Tom or Jean, if you have any thoughts about those different ideas about rural Iowa and kind of the impact of these large facilities and the consolidation. If in your experience, you've noticed any changes, or Jean, from your experience with DNR, how that was changing any kind of tone within the agency as far as the enforcement or regulation of the CAFOs.
Well, DNR's enforcement is basically only what they need to do from a law standpoint, and normally that is driven by when they can get some dollars out of it. If we want to talk about rural, I'm sitting here in the house on my family farm, and across the road there were 2 building sites with families in that are now gone and farmed right over top of. The next building site on this side of the road to the west, the house is gone. There's no family in it anymore. So in this stretch on this road, this is the only farmstead that's still here. And it comes right back to what Dr. Jones was talking about, why we have so many fewer school districts. It's a changed world.
Could I just offer a thought here? When we moved back home to Iowa in 1988, north of Decorah, where we lived for almost 33 years, we bought a small, an old farmhouse on about 25 acres. The 200 acres that were originally with that farm, it was a century farm settled by settlers from Alsace, which at that time was German, and surrounded by Norwegians. And there were small farms up and down the Locust Road, 200 acres, 240 acres, very productive, very diversified. Farmers were doing contour plowing, rotating crops, lots and lots of small dairy operations, which meant, alfalfa, grassways, buffers. That has all changed. So many of those properties have gone by the wayside and been consolidated into very large corporate farming operations. So, I have empathy for all of Northeast Iowa, all of Iowa folks who live in the country and have to contend with these huge problems. I will say, though, that, there are some things happening at the grassroots level. It's not as quick and not as large as I would hope, but I've been certainly encouraged by the cadre of young people that are involved with Northeast Iowa RC&D and some of the things they're trying to accomplish by putting together workshops and field days throughout this area. Ross Evelsizer down in Postville at RC&D has invited me and others, to help out with a field day with a farmer down there who's figured out how to become very profitable using regenerative agriculture, no-till, multi-cropping. And, at first I thought, well, that's great, but it's just a few people. But you know what? Even though there's been all this consolidation, there are still a lot of folks that, like the old days, they look and see what the neighbors are doing. And if they see or hear that neighbor is doing something different and it's profitable, the bottom line at the end of the year is better than it was in the past. Doesn't matter about how many bushels of corn per acre, it's what's your bottom line. And if multi-cropping is the way you're going, then you need to share that. And, I was thinking at this, you were all very very gifted science people and science backgrounds. I'm coming at it from a recreational standpoint, but as a rural citizen and thinking about fly fishing and all that stuff. But, you know, just for us to coexist in this area, we have got to be as supportive as we can to those farmers that really do want to try new things and try to break out of this mold and these systems that we're now in and that we have been talking about now for the last hour and 10 minutes. It just seems to me that there are positive things happening out there. I just don't know how to accelerate that. Our small group at Iowa's Coldwater Conservancy, our TU chapters, the Hawkeye Fly Fishing Association, and many other groups, many other nonprofits would be delighted to support those kinds of field days and outreach programs. And I think that's an opportunity that we should take advantage of.
Thank you very much. Oh,
So I want
Chris,
to
looks like you wanted
here.
to jump in.
Yeah, I want to comment here on Tom's comments there. And it's important to recognize that we have these types of farmers in Northeast Iowa because of the geology of the area and the way we can farm there. And so there's, you know, not as much farmable land in Northeast Iowa. A lot of it's on steep slopes. We have thin topsoils up there. And so these sort of alternative approaches here, you know, are an option there because of that, because that's marginal land. But when we look at the rest of Iowa, you know, we don't see farmers that, you know, want to take that approach. And especially at Des Moines Loeb, where we, you know, have farms of thousands of acres. And so nobody there wants to do alternative stuff, right? They want to get 4,000 acres of corn planted, you know, pronto in April and get it harvested in October and then go down to Florida. And they don't have time to mess around with all this, you know, quote unquote, alternative stuff, where that, you know, might work in Northeast Iowa because of the marginal nature of farming there. And so, you know, we really have to ask ourselves, what should be going on in Northwest Iowa or Northeast Iowa? I'm sorry. You know, what activities should we be doing there, period? Is it so marginal that we shouldn't be even growing corn and soybeans up there? I would say yes to that.
Well, I just want to say that if you read the reports of the Iowa Geological Survey for those counties at the end of the 19th century, they were saying exactly what Dr. Jones is saying. You know, so we've known that those areas are marginal land, they're fragile. The system is very flashy, right? You put nutrients on because it's a Swiss cheese kind of topography. It ends up in the water super fast. So that's also areas that are very erodible. So I think the other issue is targeting, where we want to focus our conservation efforts. And if the land isn't very good for farming and the water is still relatively clean, hello, that's your cost benefit analysis right there. That's what you want to target for conservation.
Thank you all. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit because we have quite a few audience questions that are site specific. And so, Jean, I'm going to direct these at you. And then if you aren't sure on the most up to speed thing, I might have Larry hop on here. But this is a four-parter because they're all four kind of site specific questions. One is, do they intend to build more, or is this done? Are there animals in the buildings yet? Explain this flush system and why it's not going to work. And then who usually owns the hogs or the cattle in this situation? Is it usually the local person or out of state? So, Jean, gave you a tough one there. It's a four-parter.
Well, number one, I don't know if there is any plan to expand. My guess is no. I think the reason it is the size that it is was to make the digester work. And obviously, since there's no digester, my guess is that if they were to start over, they would not have these kinds of barns, this many barns, and probably not in this location. My understanding is there are not cattle in the new barns. The other thing that we don't really talk about is there is an existing barn that's already there. And that's my guess as to why Supreme Beef went in this location, because the Walls family already had a, a barn that was there that they were utilizing, so they already had feed storage and such. So that barn is being used. According to the database, that's 722 animal units. So that barn is being used. My understanding is the 6 new barns are not. Pertaining to the manure system, you know, these are slatted barns. In the dead of winter, the manure is going to freeze on the slats and not even fall down into the shallow pit. So if it's going to freeze on the slats, how are we going to get it to move from the individual barns into the large earthen basin? That's a question I have. We've got numerous dairies up here that have facilities that are designed that way. And that tube the manure is supposed to move through freezes up in the wintertime. So the manure stays in the production area and doesn't move to the storage area, which obviously causes problems. Now, having said that, I don't know the specific design on these facilities. They may have a plan for that. I'm not aware. Of course, this is beef manure. It's thicker than hog manure. It's not going to run very well on its own, which is why they have to add additional water to it. I'm not sure if they're pumping that from the earthen basin or if they're putting well water in there. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know how it's going to work. But my guess is this is going to be a challenge for them, and they're going to have to work very hard to make it be successful. Was there another part I missed?
That was excellent. But yes, there was one more part is in I don't know if you know in this specific case, but in general, who usually owns the animals? A local person or an out-of-state company?
My understanding is that in the past, the Walls family have always owned the cattle that they have fed. Now, having said that, for this specific project, both when it was Walls Energy and now a Supreme Beef, there have been a number of different proposals put out there. When they initially went to the DNR to talk about this site, these were all going to be very high quality cattle, black hided, because they were going into a specific market. The next time I heard one of the members of this group talk, they said, well, we're going to let the community become involved. If they'd like to invest in the cattle that are being fed, we'll allow them to do that. So what the plan is now, I don't know. My guess is that the Walls family is going to own these cattle, but based on what's happened with the financial issues that have been associated with this project, I don't know if their pockets are deep enough to be able to purchase the cattle. They may be custom feeding. And we do have a number of people around here that would be quick to put cattle in those barns because that's their business model. Buy the cattle, let somebody else take care of them. So I don't know what the plan is right now. You know, the DNR sometimes records that, doesn't always, but I don't know what the plan is for who's supposed to own the cattle at this time.
Yeah. Larry, did you want to add anything on some of those? I know you're out in the area and you kind of, you're over there somewhat often and might know if there's cattle in the building or anything. Larry, you might be on mute.
My understanding and initially, as Jean said, was that it was going to be custom feeding. I don't know that that's changed. It's possible. I guess I'm one of the things that it was in the initial proposal was that this was going to revive the cow-calf industry in Northeast Iowa because farmers would raise cattle to be fed at Wells Energy or now Supreme Beef. That I'm not aware that that has happened, and I'm not sure if they are still going to be getting do custom feeding, and if indeed they do custom feeding, if those cattle will come from Northeast Iowa or they might come from any place else in the country, down south or out west. I'm not certain of that. So, but that to me could be a problem with the plan of Supreme Beef is where they get the cattle. Investing for Supreme Beef to have to invest in 10,000 head of cattle, that's a lot of money.
Right.
Yeah, I would say there's not much money right now in beef cattle, and so I would find it hard to believe they're going to own all 11,000 of these cattle based on the cattle markets right now.
And that actually, I'm sorry, Alicia, I was going to jump in because I had a follow-up question off of that. I think that's a good point to bring up. And I'm not sure who the best to answer this is. Recently, there was just a big article about how beef farmers are really upset because they're getting undercut on prices because there's a big monopoly of processing centers and they're basically picking their own prices and farmers are selling below cost production. Does anyone want to talk about that? I think that's kind of an important thing to add in here as well.
Well, I would say this, that all these plans are being made, again, looking backwards and not looking forward. There was another question in the chat about carbon farming and carbon payments. If the Biden administration is really serious about climate change, let's be honest. I'm not vegetarian. I'm not advocating for vegetarianism. I don't, usually the vegetarians get really mad at me for saying this, but we're still going to be raising cattle. We're going to be eating beef, but we're going to be eating less beef because beef is too cheap. And why is it too cheap? Because we don't incorporate all the costs of pollution that are associated with that production, from the corn to the animal itself, as we've been discussing. So going forward, if we're really going to address climate change, we don't need to be adding livestock to the landscape in Iowa. We need to be subtracting it and putting it on, again, on pasture. This is the only true sustainable solution. Clearly, this is not the outlook of the people who put together this operation. Even though they started with the biodigester, which is the next big scam of CAFOs, they're going to say that they're green because they're going to capture the methane and blah, blah, blah. And that is absolutely another example of greenwashing, okay? But these operations are not really done considering changes in the regulatory and ag policy landscape. And so it's not a good idea right now for us to expand. It's going to come back and cost us in multiple ways.
Just want to reinforce that comment about cows on pasture. I mean, basically everyone that looks at nutrient issues agrees that we have to take cattle back to pasture if we're going to solve our nutrient problems.
All right, well, we are in the last 5 minutes here, so I want to pose a final question for all of you to give your responses here. And it's a tough one, but what do we need to do to prevent another facility like Supreme Beef from being approved in the future, especially in a pristine landscape like the driftless area? Anyone want to start?
Well, I don't know that you can prevent it in the near term. I mean, that's the thing about this that's so depressing, I guess, is that we would have a producer or a family in Iowa that would ram this through in a place, that's still got some integrity from an environmental perspective. And so if they can ram it through here, I would say they can ram it through anywhere. And if you want to stop it, the law's got to be changed, and that's just the long and short of it.
I would say that Dr. Jones is absolutely correct. We need to change state law, and we need to change federal law, because right now we are locked into a system of what we call in the climate change literature maladaptation. We are adapting to our problems by creating more problems. Farmers have trouble making ends meet. They depend even more on subsidies and on confined animal feeding operations. We need to restructure the system so that we bring back together animals on the landscape. And this starts by getting rid of the master matrix, giving back local control, and putting a reset button on CAFOs at the state level. It also comes with actual monitoring done for the public good, not for the public purse. And then at the federal level, this farm bill that's coming up is going to be a big fight, because ag is a critical component of climate change mitigation. And we have seen so much greenwashing and throwing away money. The voluntary strategy, version 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. That cannot stand if we really want to address climate change. We need to demand accountability at the federal level and at the state level, and bring back local control.
Dean, you want to go?
Well, I think it comes down to what Dr. Jones said, is we need change in law. And obviously the people we've got elected right now aren't going to do anything to change. Somebody explained to me the best things politicians do is get reelected. So that means we need to show up when it's time to vote, and vote for candidates that are willing to do what we feel needs to be done in our state.
I think my chief takeaway from all of this evening is that every elected official should be thinking about all of their constituents, not just a few wealthy and powerful citizens. Clean water is a right for all Iowa citizens, and that must be protected at all costs. And those of us in the nonprofit world, if we're, working with the Trout Unlimited chapter, or the Hawkeye Fly Fishing Association, or the Iowa Coldwater Conservancy, or the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, or Iowa Environmental Council, one of the positives that has occurred over my, since the 70s when I started chasing some trout around Northeast Iowa, is we have just a wonderful group of nonprofit groups in this state. We just need to talk to each other. We need to talk to producers. We need to invite these legislators to these field days or whatever activity we're doing to try to improve a watershed, which is where I believe we really need to be focusing, and do regenerative agriculture wherever possible. I would agree that, get the cattle back on pastures, explore rotational grazing options. I know the DNR folks that I work with at the fisheries biology level, they're all looking at these things and they're great to work with. But I think it boils down to, we have to make some changes in our legislature or and in our leadership of our state government, or these things aren't going to be possible.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our panelists for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it. We have, of course, we would never leave a meeting without letting people know what they can do with this information and how to get more involved. So I'm going to share my screen really quick before we wrap up. So Alicia, you want to talk about how folks can get involved with Iowa Environmental Council, then I'll talk about Sierra Club.
Yeah. So like we kind of mentioned at the top, we've been working on this issue for many months now, and we're going to continue working on CAFO issues. So We always appreciate support in these efforts. So you can support the Iowa Environmental Council by becoming a member, and you'll get action alerts from us, legislative updates, and environmental news. I'll really quickly, just before you give your pitch, Jess, talk about one of the main things that we talked about as far as what people can do right now is writing a letter to the editor. We really encourage people to do that just to keep the conversation going, and keep the spotlight on this and keep the media attention on it. The Supreme Beef situation has gained a lot of attention, and we think that that just really helps drive the conversation and raise the awareness among people that are not always involved in these conversations. So that's kind of what we picked out as our main action item for anyone who's interested in taking action after this evening.
Thank you. And then if you're interested in getting involved in Sierra Club, I have our website there, and please join as a member, support our work. We are going to continue working on Supreme Beef. It's not over yet, and we're considering litigation. And another thing is we're going to be focusing on kind of like what our panelists mentioned today is what we are going to be doing in replace of industrial agriculture. So get involved with Sierra Club, and please do write the letters to the editor. I know a lot of people ask you for that, but you don't know how important that is to have that commentary in the news on a regular basis to make sure the issue doesn't fall out of people's minds. And then also for people who are kind of starting to think that they might disagree with Supreme Beef, your letter to the editor might be what convinces them and might bring them to our side. So they are so much more important than sometimes we realize to keep that commentary in the news. So I want to just thank everyone for coming today, and thank you to our panelists. We appreciate this conversation and this knowledge and your history. And thank you to all of the organizations and our team of folks that have been working really hard on this over the past year to try to stop Supreme Beef. And it's not over yet, folks, so just stay involved. We're going to have a lot of work to do if we are going to be serious about taking on Iowa's water crisis in regards to agriculture and CAFO. So thank you all, and I hope you have a great evening.